Thank you. Good afternoon. Go Spurs, go. I'll tell you a funny story. I've got a 12-year-old and he finished 5th grade. And so when I was in 5th grade, they didn't have graduations. Apparently they have graduations for all sorts of grades now. So they had graduation, and you know, they had a slide for each kid and where are you going to be in 15 years? And his response was playing NBA for the Miami Heat. Didn't go over too well. I was fearful for his life. All right, so what I'd like to do is talk about two things, and I think the video really captures why we're here. If we could get the lights, maybe the slides might be a little easier to see. And I'd like to start out by obviously teeing up the issue in terms of a loss of working lands, rural landscapes. And I think we're all familiar with the statistics related to that. And one of the things that, as part of the Institute in collaboration with TALT and so forth, that we're trying to address is this issue of a loss of working lands. And this graphic, I think, really shows the magnitude and the challenge that we're facing. Texas is a big place, 171 million acres of forests, farms, ranches, and 25 million people use the natural resources that are derived from these open spaces, these rural landscapes. 4% public, that little Texas there, 96% private, the big Texas. You look at, of that 96%, 86% is rural. And so most of what we're talking about is what TALT and others are trying to do in terms of conserving those rural working lands. And with 25 million people, the number of folks that live in rural landscapes is about 10%. Most people live in the city. The number of people that own those lands is less than 1%. So less than 250,000 landowners as stewards in essence impact the resources that are provided to this larger audience. And that's a message that's going to be more and more challenging for us in moving forward and trying to make that linkage between the public benefits that private lands offer. And so I'm going to talk about two things. The first is, and these just came out today, Land Trends is currently being updated. And so the new ag data came out about a month and a half ago, Blair, I think. And so we're starting, we hope to release the full Land Trends in about a month and a half. And so in looking at the change in number of farms, the brighter the color, the greater that number of less than 100 acres, you start seeing patterns. You see a donut, in essence, around Dallas, Fort Worth. You see some dark hues and colorations that are anchored next to those urban centers. And that's not too surprising. 500 acres in size or less, it's even more pronounced. And again, this is all new data. The number of farms in the less than 100 acres has increased about 30% since the last ag census data. So fragmentation continues and really is growing at a pretty rapidly rate. And in the last 5 years, we've lost about 600,000 acres is what we're seeing from some of the preliminary estimates. Here's an interesting trend though. 1997, the number of lands that were under wildlife valuation compared to currently. And so we're seeing a shift in terms of the types of land uses. I'm not sure who's doing work down here, but someone's doing quite a bit of work in that county. And so we're seeing that in different parts of the state. So there is a bright point to all this, I think, as well. So that's a real quick review of kind of where we're at. And now what I'd like to talk about is an effort relative to promoting this idea of private land stewardship. It's obvious that the value of private lands needs further attention. And the Institute at Texas A&M has been around for a while, but it wasn't until really the leadership of Neil Wilkins that we really started to push forward. And with Neil's departure and me assuming his position, I began to sort of take an inward look in terms of what we as an institute do and how can we better serve a broader audience relative to the conservation of natural resources, particularly through the lens of private land stewardship. And one of the things that we proposed, and this started about a year ago, is this idea of establishing a center for private land stewardship and policy. So truly a center that could bring people of like minds together to address this issue. And the outcome is to reverse or change those trends. That's what we're hoping to do. And I provided that vision to the leadership at A&M, AgriLife Research and Extension, as our #1 priority. And they endorsed our moving forward and establishing this center. But then I started looking around and talking to other people about this concept and met with some of the folks at the Noble Foundation in Oklahoma. And they kind of had the same idea too. Of course, found that Blair and Tall were also interested in looking at private land stewardship from a water conservation perspective. And lastly, the East Wildlife Foundation, where Neil went, also has a strong emphasis or focus on private land stewardship. And so it's kind of a convergence of interests. And the thinking at that point was, rather than go at this alone, why don't we work together? Why don't we establish a collaborative center, a partnership of like-minded people and interests to basically respond to this challenge, respond to this need. And the idea is this: a Center for Private Land Stewardship and Policy that looks at research to include land trends, some of the things that I just showed. You got to understand the problem and what's the driver and where it's happening to better understand how to tackle it. Training future natural resource leaders and practitioners. I asked myself, who's the next Carter Smith? Who's the next Director of EPA of Fish and Wildlife Service? Are we as a land-grant university doing a good job in training those folks through the lens of private land stewardship? I think there's a need for that. Informing priority issues through research and innovative policies. So again, a lot of the things that we've done historically, but doing it as a collaborative, as a partnership. And last but certainly not least, assisting private landowners in the practice of land stewardship. What that means and what that looks like. And the outcomes for this center is to obviously build relationships through this partnership, through this collaborative, foster innovation, and lastly, and probably most importantly, promote this vision of private land stewardship nationally. And so that's kind of the big idea, is a national center for private land stewardship and policy. I'm going to go through a couple of slides and give you a flavor of some of the things that we're wanting to do through this center. And so as an institute, we do a lot of things that support this idea of private land stewardship, right? TALT does the same thing, and so forth. But the center serves as an aggregator and an integrator in terms of those actions and activities. And so that's kind of the idea. You know, I talked about land trends. Imagine land trends at a national level. Texas is just an example, but that's happening in Oklahoma, North Carolina, Georgia. And so being able to take that message at a national scale and advocate and make that linkage. Looking back at the demographics, most people don't get or see that linkage between the public benefits of private lands. And so that's a story that I think we need to do a better job in telling. Training, I mentioned training future natural resource leaders and practitioners. At A&M, we're currently in the process of developing a graduate certificate in private land stewardship and policy. So I think that's the first step. You know, something that again is geared toward promoting and training that future Carter Smith, that future Director of Fish and Wildlife. informing issues. You know, the Texas Land Trends is one example. We hope to host a conservation finance summit with TALT next month that looks at how can we address issues like water and endangered species that doesn't include a regulatory hammer, but instead looks at incentive and market-based approaches. And so looking for solutions to these thorny issues through those market-based incentive type of approaches. And lastly, assisting private landowners through an academy, training county tax appraisers. I think that's one of the challenges in some of these counties is demonstrating the wide breadth in terms of options and so forth that a tax appraiser has in a given county from a wildlife valuation perspective, for example. So the center is organized via a memorandum of understanding. There's a collaborative of founding members, and we met with Noble last week, and we're moving forward. We're drafting that MOU. Neil Wilkins was up there the last 3 days, and the East is on board, and I think TALT is interested in being one of the founding members as part of this collaborative. And there'll be a structure. It's a virtual center, at least initially, but the long-range goal is to convert that into a 501c3 type of structure to, again, address and integrate and look at addressing this issue of private land stewardship. And so this slide kind of shows some of the structure, some of the activities I talked about, some of the outcomes, education, facilitation, advocacy, leveraging of resources. And oftentimes when you think of leveraging of resources, you think time and money, that's a big one. But it's also a leveraging of ideas. And I'm not sure how many folks have read the book Where Good Ideas Come From. Now I'd like to show a short video and wrap up this idea of a center.
For the past 5 years, I've been investigating this question of where good ideas come from. It's the kind of problem I think all of us are intrinsically interested in. We want to be more creative, we want to come up with better ideas, we want our organizations to be more innovative. I've looked at this problem from an environmental perspective. What are the spaces that have historically led to unusual rates of creativity and innovation? And what I've found in all of these systems, there are these recurring patterns that you see again and again that are crucial to creating environments that are unusually innovative. One pattern I call the slow hunch, that breakthrough ideas almost never come in a moment of great insight, in a sudden stroke of inspiration. Most important ideas take a long time to evolve, and they spend a long time dormant in the background. It isn't until the idea has had 2 or 3 years, sometimes 10 or 20 years to mature, that it suddenly becomes accessible to you and useful to you in a certain way. And this is partially because good ideas normally come from the collision between smaller hunches, so that they form something bigger than themselves. So you see a lot in the history of innovation, cases of someone who has half of an idea. There's a great story about the invention of the World Wide Web and Tim Berners-Lee. This is a project that Berners-Lee worked on for 10 years. But when he started, he didn't have a full vision for this new medium he was going to invent. He started working on one project as a side project to help him organize his own data. He scrapped that after a couple of years, and he started working on another thing. And only after about 10 years did the full vision of the World Wide Web come into being. That is, more often than not, how ideas happen. They need time to incubate, and they spend a lot of time in this partial hunch form. The other thing that's important when you think about ideas this way is that when ideas take form in this hunch state, they need to collide with other hunches. Oftentimes, the thing that turns a hunch into a real breakthrough is another hunch that's lurking in somebody else's mind. And you have to figure out a way to create systems that allow those hunches to come together and turn into something bigger than the sum of their parts. That's why, for instance, the coffee house in the age of the Enlightenment, or the Parisian salons of modernism, were such engines of creativity, because they created a space where ideas could mingle and swap and create new forms. When you look at the problem of innovation from this perspective, it sheds a lot of important light on the debate we've been having recently about what the internet is doing to our brains. Are we getting overwhelmed with an always connected, multitasking lifestyle? And is that going to lead to less sophisticated thoughts as we move away from the slower, deeper, contemplative state of reading, for instance? Obviously, I'm a big fan of reading, but I think it's important to remember that the great driver of scientific innovation and technological innovation has been the historic increase in connectivity and our ability to reach out and exchange ideas with other people, and to borrow other people's hunches and combine them with our hunches and turn them into something new. That really has, I think, been, more than anything else, the primary engine of creativity and innovation over the last 600 or 700 years. And so yes, it's true we're more distracted. But what has happened that is really miraculous and marvelous over the last 15 years is that we have so many new ways to connect and so many new ways to reach out and find other people who have that missing piece that will complete the idea we're working on, or to stumble serendipitously across some amazing new piece of information that we can use to build and improve our own ideas. That's the real lesson of where good ideas come from, that chance favors the connected mind.
All right. So one of the slides that I had talked about a convergence of interests. Perhaps that's really a collision of interests in terms of the partnering with TALT and East and now Noble Foundation. And my last or concluding thoughts are this idea of a center for private land stewardship is really a center for private lands innovation. You know, one of the comments that Steve Johnson talked about is bigger than the sum of their parts. And I do believe that's true, and that's the value, I think, of this center, where it could be, in essence, a mechanism for that connectivity as it relates to private land stewardship and being a delivery mechanism for that innovation that benefits private landowners and private land stewardship across Texas and the nation. So that's the big idea.